if critical race theory, oftentimes it does, or even with the critical ethnic studies, becomes a demonization of white people, the demonization of Western America, the Western world, the demonization of Judeo-Christian ethics, then that, not only is that not helpful, it's destructive.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. When you think of the word Zionist, do you imagine an American black pastor? Meet my guest this week, Pastor Dumisani Washington. Dumisani Washington, it's so wonderful to have you with me on Global Perspectives. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me with you, Ellie. It's great to be here with you.
I've been an admirer of your work for some time, and so for our audience to know, you are the founder and CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, IBSI for short. Now, Dumisani, again, I've been an admirer of your work, and I think that everything that you've done to promote the black community's relationship with Israel and the Jewish people is extraordinary. So my first question to you is, have you always felt this personal support for Israel?
For a long time, yes. It kind of evolved over a period of time. Raised Christian in a home, and that very much committed to church and the scriptures and everything. And so there was always this love for Israel that was from the preaching, the teaching, that type of thing. Didn't know anything about the modern state of Israel. It was just very much of what I call a biblical Zionism, if you will. But it was later on in life that I became more aware of the Jewish state of Israel. I became more aware of Israel's relationship with Africa and kind of made a foray into it politically a little bit when I was living in California and spoke at a city council hearing in Sacramento. And Sacramento was going to become a sister city, I believe, with Ashkelon. That was my first taste of anti-Zionism, if you will, because it was a huge hearing and there was a lot of things said in that room on that night. And I realized that standing with Israel in that sense, particularly where the black community was concerned, because so much of the negative things that were said about Israel had to do with racism and apartheid and those types of things. And I just kind of started doing it from there.
Well, you know, you just mentioned a lot, and I'd love to unpack some of what you spoke about just now. Indeed, a lot of the accusations against Israel are accusations made by people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and a chorus of voices like that, who accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, as well as committing genocide in events like the recent Hamas conflict, when Hamas was raining down 4,000 rockets on Israel. So, Dumisani, tell us a little bit about your own experience with Israel, and how do you counter this narrative that accuses Israel of being an apartheid state?
Well, my first visit to Israel was 2012. I was the guest at an African-American pastor's tour with Christians United for Israel. I have friends who work with CUFI. I served on CUFI's staff a few years after that for about 7 years. And so that was my first experience to the Holy Land. And it was an amazing time. I've been there multiple times since then and attempted to educate myself on the conflict, right? I was aware of Dr. King's legacy and the civil rights community of that day, particularly in the 60s and 70s, its stance with Israel, its call for justice. Again, it was never anti-Arab, but it was never anti-Israel. It was always fair-minded. And that was something that very much impressed me. I pride myself on being somewhat aware of Black American history. And so that was a very, very important part of it for me as well, as a legacy, if you will. And so being aware of the situation on the ground, doing research, getting information, I found that not only were those types of liable, as you were just saying, in terms of those who make those claims, but they did very much damage when it came to any type of peace effort, right? The demonization of Israel in no way helps the Palestinians, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza. And particularly for our organization, when that demonization exploits the Black community and uses terms like Zionism is racism or Israel's an apartheid state, not only are those things not true, but those things are actually exploiting what apartheid was for Black South Africans, what racism and Jim Crow was for Black Americans. And so for me and for our organization, that's another reason why we take the fight so seriously. Not only does it not bring peace, but actually just muddies the waters and makes the issue of justice even that much harder to achieve.
And this is something I've heard from others who, South African Blacks who experienced apartheid. And they have said over and again that when you look at Israel and this diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country where people are in fact living side by side with each other, and you contrast that to what actually took place in apartheid in South Africa, it is actually really just a horror to compare those two things, and really diminishes the South African experience. Dumisani, you have done tremendous work, truly, in building understanding of Israel and the realities that Israel actually is. In fact, one of the wonderful things you've done is a book titled Zionism and the Black Church. And in Zionism and the Black Church, in your book, you go through the biblical tie to Israel, the Israelite diaspora, and in that chapter, you focus on the Mizrahi Jewish experience, the experience of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you why you think that's an important experience, that you've spent an entire chapter on the subject.
Well, for several different reasons, Ellie, and I think probably chief among those was that in my advocacy over the years of within the Jewish community, throughout the African American community, and beyond, right, different peoples in different countries, I was made aware of the Mizrahi story, the over 850,000 Jewish refugees who had to flee or forced out of, as you know, North Africa and the Middle East, what are often called the forgotten refugees. And for that reason, most people, particularly non-Jewish, are not aware of it. I had heard about the Ethiopian Jews, as many people have, right? That whole Operation Moses and Solomon and that whole very, very dramatic airlift, right? Or even Operation Magic Carpet with the Jews from Yemen and everything. But somehow this one, beneath the radar and we end our investigation for lots of different reasons why they're called the forgotten refugees. And so I was fascinated by it. And so it's just fascinating to know it's part of the Israel story, right? But especially if you're talking about doing Israel advocacy within the Black community or any of the diverse community throughout the United States of America, that story, and we found it to be true, not only is it fascinating, not only does it tell a broader picture of Israel, we're simply telling Israel's story, how the Jewish state, after almost 2,000 years, with the exception of a small remnant that was there, the Jewish people didn't have a homeland. And so you're talking about both Israel declaring independence on May the 14th. May the 15th, there's an Arab-Israeli war that in some instances is continuing on in some form today in terms of intifadas and that type of thing. But Jews returning to the land from Europe, from Yemen, from Morocco. I mean, you have this happening at the same time while Israel's fighting the war, receiving what were refugees, if you will, coming to the land. It's an amazing story. And we found when people hear that story, it tells more of Israel.
It is an amazing story. And so just to clarify for our audience, this is a forgotten refugee story of these 800,000 plus Jews who were forced mostly out of their homes at the 1948 creation of the State of Israel. And these refugees wind up coming to Israel and being absorbed in Israel starting in the 1948 years. And so in your book, you continue on. You also spend some time, as you mentioned, on the legacy of Dr. King. And I think it was that time period when you saw American Jews standing side by side with American Blacks and fighting for civil rights. I think it was in some ways a golden era of the relationship, which has since then really eroded. So I just wondered, Dumisani, what do you think the Jewish community could be doing more in terms of building better relationships with the Black community?
Ellie, honestly, what I see on the ground, and I get a chance to travel the country and everything, I see Black Jewish synergy in lots of different areas. Of course, the media doesn't highlight that, right? But it's really, really true. So in answer to that question, it's difficult for me to answer it simply because I have so many examples, whether it's the Jewish religious community or not, working closely and side by side, whether it's Black pastors, Black community leaders. I just came from Chicago a couple of weeks ago. I was there with a pastor there is doing amazing work. And I know about him because I was introduced to him through the Jewish community there. And they've been working together, doing some amazing things right there in South Chicago. So I don't know. I'll say this way. The greatest critiques usually of the Jewish community of Israel are usually my Jewish friends. They do a pretty good job of that in terms of assessing and that type of thing. So I usually leave that to them. I tell them I let them do that part, and I do the Black American part and everything.
Well, Dumisani, so I think that's an interesting response. And maybe what I'm understanding is that you're saying the Jewish community is doing a lot and really trying to make the effort to reach out to the Black community. So what do you think might be the stumbling block? What is it that's getting in the way of the Black-Jewish relationship in this country?
Well, two things. Number one, the synergy is still there. It doesn't get talked about, doesn't get highlighted. That's the first thing. There is a lot of cooperation with the Jewish and Black communities in different parts of the country. Unfortunately, along with that, a lot of the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, rhetoric, negative types of things, the distortion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has over a period of decades sought to exploit the Black community. What I mean by that is that type of messaging, as I share this oftentimes in our lectures, we have to understand, just in context very quickly, that the PLO, for example, Yasser Arafat, who took over in 1969, there was a concerted effort by Israel's enemies, particularly by the PLO, to focus their messaging particularly on the Black community, right? Particularly when it came to the Black civil rights leadership. I find it ironic all the time. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. Yasser Arafat comes to power in the PLO in 1969, and his focus, as if because Dr. King is gone, I'm not saying that's the case, but it's almost as if that was the case. He focuses on some of those very same leaders, giving them distorted information, causing this for them to see it in a very distorted way. By the time you get to the mid 1970s, he's standing in the United Nations, calling Israel all kinds of racist and all those. That's been going on for a long time. That was focused on the Black leadership, particularly because of the synergy between the Black and the Jewish communities. Almost as if they say, hey, these people are friends. If we drive this wedge, right, then we can go a long way into demonizing Israel. So that's some of what's going on, Ellie. There's so much of that baggage that's there, and it's been something of a vacuum. And our organization is seeking to really address that in a real substantive way.
Well, I think it's a brilliant analysis, and we have in fact seen the Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices drive that wedge between the Jewish community and the Black, Hispanic, and other communities through intersectionality and other efforts. So it again reminds me how much I appreciate everything that you're doing, and so I want to talk a little bit about IBSI. Tell me what you think has been most successful in your efforts. I know that you're doing, if I understand correctly, you're doing outreach to the Black community in America, but you're also doing work with Africa and African countries. So maybe you could break it down for us.
Well, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, we formed in actually 2013 after that trip to Israel that I took in 2012. I did lecturing across the country for about a year, and then I went on staff with CUFI. So my son has kind of been running it up until the last several months when I was no longer on staff with CUFI. We parted amicably, but I returned to IBSI to do this full time. And one of the reasons why you see Africa featured prominently in our advocacy is that we wholeheartedly believe that any real substantive Israel advocacy within the Black community has to have along with it the African element. And I mean that in several different ways. Number one, Israel's long and prosperous, in that sense, good, I should say, relationship with Africa since the time of Golda Meir as the foreign minister in the early 1950s, right? That story must be told in Black America as well to truly understand Israel's history with Africa, but also to push back on the narrative of Israel being this racist apartheid regime. Also, as you know, Ellie, one of the things that happens where Israel's enemies are concerned, they often use Africa. Apartheid, again, is South Africa. Why are they using that? Not only is it a demonization, but it also does this continued dismissal of Israel as some sort of anti-Black, anti-African entity when nothing could be further from the truth. Or when we say things like Zionism is racism, once again, those themes are recurring. So what IBSI does, it seeks to, number one, really give the education, right? To give the information about Israel Israel's relationship with Africa, and the Black-Jewish synergy. And I'll just end by saying this. When we talk about the education piece of it, you had mentioned Dr. King, and you referred to the Jewish community like Rabbi Heschel. They have those iconic pictures of them marching together like in Selma. Well, we teach at IBSI that a generation before that, there was Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck fame. And here you had this Jewish philanthropist who helps fund what we know as Rosenwald schools, right? And not only that, Julius Rosenwald's rabbi, M.L. Hirsch, was one of the founders of the NAACP. So that whole synergy before Dr. King was even born, right? You have this Black Jewish synergy already there, not just helping in terms of the community here, but really setting the stage worldwide. This is what justice looks like. This is what coming together looks like.
Yeah, I think the Julius Rosenwald story is very, very unknown, and I definitely encourage everyone in the audience to look it up because it's fascinating stuff. You also, Dumisani, in your work, you've also written about how the Zionist story, the aspiration of the Jewish people to return to the Jewish homeland, the dream for Zion for thousands of years, that this is something that resonates with Black people. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and what are all of the messages that you think resonate most deeply?
Well, you're asking a pastor to say all. I talk a lot, so I'm trying to make sure this thing. So it really is, Ellie. This goes back centuries, right? So let me just really quickly. You're talking about a Zionism that, particularly in the New World, when it came to slavery, the Negro spirituals, which are the songs that were sung on slave plantations and throughout the South, of Black people who are longing for freedom. And those songs were almost always said in the Old Testament. Go down, Moses, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, Elijah Rock. I mean, these songs were songs of deliverance, of freedom. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, right? There are songs in the New Testament as well, right? But these songs were strictly biblical. Harriet Tubman was called Moses, right? So you've had this for literally hundreds of years, these songs. And it's funny, some of those songs are still sung in Black churches today here long after slavery. We're still singing some of those songs about Zion, right? So Zion became a metaphor for freedom, right? Zion becomes this metaphor for the breaking of shackles and the breaking of chains. And so in the political era, everybody from W.B. Du Bois to Marcus Garvey to even Malcolm X. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm X, who was nobody's Zionist, if you will, but he even referred to how Zionism was a rallying cry for the Jews, the way that Pan-Africanism needed to be a rallying cry for Black people. Even Malcolm X pointed to the power of Zionism and what it actually meant to longing to be free. So that has always been a part of the Black ethos, both secular and particularly religious.
I want to throw in one more, which is Bob Marley, the most famous, I think, reggae star of all time, and maybe even I feel like almost the creator of the entire genre. So yes, Zion I believe has had this powerful, effect over the Black imagination, and I do hope it becomes another point of unity between the Jewish people and the Black people. And so, speaking of unity, I'm going to keep coming back to this. What is the work that you're doing that you think is going to help promote this unity between the two peoples?
Of the things, there are three branches of IBSI, and one is our media and our content videos that will be released, as well as our writing. Another one is a speakers bureau, everything from preaching sermons to speaking in churches, synagogues. We've been doing that for a while. But the centerpiece of what we do, the third part, is called the Peace Initiative. And it's an acronym that stands for Plan for Education, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. And in this initiative, what we are doing is recruiting young, between 18 to 40 plus, they could be even older as well, men and women, Black American as well as African, across the country. We'll be connecting this with Africa as well. And they will be doing several things, going through a study period, learning about ancient Israel, the modern state of Israel, the United Nations, Israel's relationship that way, by some amazing professors and teachers from Israel, from Africa, and from the U.S. Then they will travel to Africa. We'll choose a nation. It'll probably either be Zimbabwe, South Africa. We'll choose a nation that it begins because we want them to see that Africa-Israel connection from that perspective as well. They will also travel to Israel, of course, to the Holy Land, and see the sites, everything from the modern tech giant that is Israel to all of the holy sites. And then when they return, Ellie, to their homes, they will form what we call TESFA centers. TESFA is the Amharic word for hope. And they will be the hub of Black Jewish synergy in their cities across the country, as well as a certain type of advocacy that happens in some of the African nations as well. We believe that it'll be a game changer. Not because we think we're so smart, but we think that what we stumbled onto is something that is just simply renewed. There is an ancient tie, as you probably saw in the book, between Israel and Africa, just like there's a very old tie between the Black and Jewish community here in the United States. What we are aiming to do is tap into that, not just historically, but then reinterpret it for what it means right now. We believe it's very, very crucial. And so that's what we're doing with our peace initiative, again, hoping to launch it finally later on in January.
That sounds incredible, and I definitely would love to keep hearing more about it. I have a question on that for you. What we're finding, as I'm sure you know, in the Jewish community is that young Jews are becoming less and less supportive of Israel every year, unfortunately. These are what the studies are showing. Do you think that this kind of advocacy that you're talking about, will it influence young Black people to understand Israel better?
Number one, yes, we do. Our main emphasis is always education. The reason why we chose Institute for part of our word, we believe that it'll educate in a way that's not really happening now. Some of the things that we discuss both in our book and in our advocacy aren't really discussed now. And again, I want to emphasize is not because we think we're so brilliant. It's because it's almost like a treasure trove. When some of the older generation have either read my book, and that's on the older Black generation especially, or have come to lectures or church services, whatever, what I almost always hear is that either A, I didn't know that, or B, I forgot about X, Y, and Z. And we believe that there's a time for this to be uncovered, right? As a pastor, I can say it's in the spiritual sense, there's a restoration that's actually going on. We believe that it's happening when it comes to understanding history, legacy, right? Heritage. And we believe that part of that Black American heritage has much to do with our Jewish brothers and sisters, how that story has been told from Dr. King, of course, all the way to Booker T. Washington and to now.
That sounds amazing, and education is always the key. Are you hopeful that we can see a strengthening of relations between American Jewry, Israeli Jewry, and American Blacks?
I am. What we say in our organization, Ellie, is that we're going to change the world, right? And we figure that's how we're going to see, we believe we're going to see not only just this positive movement, we believe we're going to see a shift. Conversations that we're having conversations with young Black Americans and Africans that are offline in terms of they're not, social media, because that gets all crazy, as you know, right? We're having conversations and we are seeing the hunger. We are seeing the desire. When we talk to young Africans, for example, the entrepreneurs and everything, they understand the importance of Israel, both biblically, obviously, but also in terms of technology and all of those types of things. We're seeing all kinds of signs of this being a new day. And that's why we want to connect our advocacy there in terms of Africa with what's going on in terms of Black America and have those entities come together, young Africans, young Black Americans coming together, going through this journey together. And so we believe the timing is right to really not just put forth a new narrative, but really completely change the game.
Well, I couldn't be more excited at the prospect of changing the game. I think we're well overdue for that. And so before we wrap up, I have to talk with you a little bit about the state of race relations here at home in the United States. What's your take on what's going on here?
I think you have two different things happening, right? I think you have a media narrative, and then you have what's going on the ground. Now, in no way want to gloss over, is racism an issue? Unfortunately, yeah, as long as there's people, there's going to be discrimination, anti-Semitism, all of those things. Are we all at each other's throats the way the media would have us? No, I don't. And again, I say that because I have the privilege of traveling the country, but I get to see things that the media, again, would never report on. So I think that you have this whole epic story again of light and dark happening, right? You have cynical people who are reporting what they want to report for all. I think it was Barack Obama said, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So there's going to be that type of thing, right? But I think that you also have a different narrative of people wanting more and actually kind of pushing past the propaganda and everything like that. Now, sadly, because of a lot of constant, what I would call race baiting, right? Not so much, and let me be clear about that. When we consider the fact that the nation would rally around the killing of George Floyd last year or Michael Brown several years before, but at the same time would not care at all about the children who've been slaughtered in New Orleans and Oakland and Chicago since that time, or the schools that are not serving people since that, all those types of things, we see that unfortunately communities get used and exploited for other people's purposes. What we're hopeful for.
I just want to jump in because
yes,
what
ma'am,
you're
please.
pointing, just to clarify, when you're talking about the children who are being slaughtered, you're talking about urban crime.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Let me go ahead and step all the way into the controversy. When you have misguided, quote unquote, justice organizations wanting to defund or even abolish police, and the result of the ground on that is the highest homicides that have been recorded, according to the FBI, in probably decades, right? As a direct result, you have city leaders saying this is a direct result. That's not justice, right? That's actually disinformation that's actually causing more vulnerable neighborhoods to become even more vulnerable, right? And the reason I say that in the context of what you're saying in terms of race, what we have found, again, in our organization, and this is one of the reasons why our peace initiative approaches it this way, we seek community leaders who are doing substantive work, who are not caught up in headlines, who are not caught up in hyperdrama, but are really understanding the issues on the ground. And we want to partner with them to solve issues of crime, solve issues of displacement, of disenfranchisement, of young people having the opportunity to have jobs and things available to them. These are the things that are very, very important to us in terms of what we hear on the ground. And so I think that because of people like that, because of people like Corey Books out there in Chicago, and because of other pastors and everything who are doing the work, and many of them working closely with the Jewish community and doing that work, this is why I'm hopeful. Beyond the headlines, beyond the other hype, I believe that there's substantive work being done on the ground. So yeah, I am hopeful for that reason.
Wonderful. And I have one more for you. Critical race theory in schools. Being taught in schools. What are your thoughts?
Yes, ma'am. Again, there's two sides to that. If you're talking about, I mentioned this in my book, although I don't call the critical race theory, I talk about the critical ethnic studies curriculum, which is a kind of a related issue, if you will. If you're talking about history, or if you're talking about telling the whole story about everyone's contributions, I'm all for that, right? But if you're talking about the demonization of someone else, right? If critical race theory, oftentimes it does, or even with the critical ethnic studies, becomes the demonization of white people, the demonization of Western America, the Western world, the demonization of Judeo-Christian ethics, then not only is that not helpful, it's destructive, right? So unfortunately, we have two camps. We have some who simply want a wholehearted, holistic telling of history, right? Or here are all the people, how the contributions that they've made. But unfortunately, you have another camp who simply want to destroy America, who want to bash white people. That helps no one. It solves nothing. It brings no justice. It brings no healing. So as far as the negative aspects of what we see in critical race theory, we're completely against it. It doesn't help anything. It only tears down. We're not seeking to tear anything down. We want to build up. Unfortunately, sometimes build up means having to call out the stuff that's not right? But sometimes that's actually part of it. So the negative parts of that, no, we're completely against it as an organization as well.
Well, I can't help but reflect back to you that in my experience, it would seem obvious that that these voices that are calling for policies like defund the police, as you just mentioned, or the teaching of critical race theory in the essence of trying to demonize white America and Western civilization, that it does completely undermine the black community, because ultimately they're the ones who pay. You know, I always tell people, if you defund the police, what happens is that the wealthy people go and hire private security guards, and we're already seeing that in places like San Francisco. It's the poor communities that wind up paying the price for these crazy policies. And so I'm hopeful, Dumisani, that more Americans will hear your voice and learn of your work, and that reason will prevail. I believe in America, and I believe that reason will prevail. So I just want to thank you so much for all of the work that you do with IBSI, that you did with CUFI, and Dumisani Washington, thank you so much for joining me on Global Perspectives.
Thank you, Ellie. It was great being with you.
Jews have been yearning for Zion since we lost our homeland, Israel. Black Americans were yearning for Zion through the era of slavery and the civil rights movement. Dumisani Washington is one man who's bringing our peoples together and reminding these two communities of how much we have in common. Thanks so much for joining me on Global Perspectives. Join me the next time.